In the summer of 1863, while cannon fire echoed across Gettysburg hundreds of miles to the north, a different kind of war was being waged in the quiet hills of Middle Tennessee, a war not fought with muskets, but with shadows and secrets. Something unspeakable had taken root on the sprawling acres of Rosewood Manor, the Chamberlain family's magnificent cotton plantation. 73 people had vanished over 18 months. Not slaves fleeing chaos, not soldiers lost to battles, but ordinary men, women, and even families, workers who had simply stepped too close to the truth of how the Chamberlains had amassed wealth far beyond what the land alone could provide. What followed in the aftermath was not reported in any newspaper, not whispered in polite society. Military records were sealed, orders issued by Washington bureaucrats determined that the world must never know. But buried in those archives, the truth waits like a ghost, one of methodical cruelty, of industrialized disappearance. Each person catalogued, processed, and eliminated, leaving behind no trace, no grieving family, no possibility of justice. And the Chamberlains, as ordinary as any Southern aristocrats might appear, became the architects of a fortune built on human erasure. Ezekiel Chamberlain, heir to the Rosewood estate, carried the arrogance of power in every step. 6 feet tall, steel-grey eyes, hair prematurely silver, a man who appeared polished, refined, almost civilized. But beneath the veneer, there was a coldness that belonged to predators, not men. He had a mind for numbers, for chemistry, for manipulation, and he wielded it without conscience. Every contract, every ledger, every seemingly benign transaction on the plantation concealed layers of calculation designed to mask what no outsider could imagine. Rosewood Manor itself was a monument to deception. Its white columns gleamed in the Tennessee sun, crystal chandeliers refracted light in the grand halls. Italian marble fireplaces spoke of culture and refinement, but each stone, each polished surface, each corridor was a witness to the unspoken. Workers came and went, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, appearing to labor yet disappearing without explanation. And as neighbors whispered, Ezekiel and his wife Margaret orchestrated the unseen, the unrecorded, and the unthinkable, ensuring the Chamberlain dynasty thrived while the bodies of the disappeared dissolved into obscurity. Tonight, we are stepping into that shadow. This is not a story of Southern charm or plantation romance. This is a story of systems of control, of calculated elimination, and of a power so precise it could erase human life as easily as chalk on a blackboard. We are about to descend into the Chamberlain world, a world where morality is subordinate to profit, and every human being is just a variable in a ledger that decides who lives and who vanishes. Rosewood Manor stood like a gleaming testament to power and control, its 6 towering Corinthian columns framing a view of nearly 2,000 acres of Tennessee black soil. To the casual eye, it was a symbol of stability and prosperity, a plantation that had survived decades of economic storms. But within its walls, a darker economy thrived, a system of human exploitation hidden beneath the veneer of cotton, ledger books, and polite Southern hospitality. Every decision, every gesture by Ezekiel and his wife Margaret was calculated with precision, as though they were conducting a symphony whose score was written in the lives of men and women. Ezekiel's brilliance lay in his audacity. While Confederate and Union forces clawed for control of the Cumberland River and surrounding farmlands, he positioned himself as indispensable to both sides. Cotton flowed from Rosewood Manor to quartermasters of the Confederacy at inflated prices, then returned, intercepted by Union agents, to sell again at profit. 1 crop, 2 payments, 0 conscience. And yet, even this exploitation of wartime chaos was only a fraction of his scheme. Ezekiel understood that wealth could be multiplied not just through trade, but through secrecy, fear, and the quiet removal of obstacles, people who asked too many questions, who didn't fit into the Chamberlain calculus. Margaret Chamberlain, in her own right, wielded power with ruthless efficiency. She managed the household like a military commander, documenting every morsel of food, every candle burned, every thread of cloth. But behind her meticulous bookkeeping lay a darker ledger. Plans for operations her neighbors would never comprehend, protocols for erasing the inconvenient, and careful arrangements to ensure that any worker who stumbled into the truth would vanish without leaving evidence. Her beauty, long since hardened into the lines of control and intimidation, inspired fear rather than admiration. The estate's inhabitants learned early that the Chamberlain's grace was a mask, one that concealed calculated cruelty. The first disappearances were subtle, almost imperceptible. A worker here, a seamstress there, people who seemed perfectly ordinary, suddenly gone. Letters unreceived, wagons left behind, belongings mysteriously vanished. Contracts were cited, infractions alleged, all documented with such precision that any complaint seemed frivolous or false. Federal investigators, when they eventually caught wind of the situation, were met with pages of signed statements, dates, and witnesses, the perfect illusion of legality. Yet those familiar with the estate, like Josiah Creek, the head overseer, began noticing gaps in the counts. 67 workers on the books, 39 in the fields, the rest evaporated, and so the system revealed itself slowly, like a trap springing shut. Midnight visits, lanterns cutting through darkness, the hush of heavy boots on wooden floors. Pale men, educated and refined, moving with purpose, carrying leather satchels filled with instruments not meant for harvest, not meant for medicine, but for erasure. Creek watched, heart pounding as he glimpsed the machinery of human disappearance in motion. Each night, Rosewood Manor extended its dominion, not with armies, but with method, secrecy, and a single immutable principle. Profit built on bodies, power consolidated through fear, and the unspoken understanding that 73 graves could secure a dynasty. The first disappearance that truly cracked the illusion of Rosewood Manor's benevolence belonged to Thomas Henley, a skilled blacksmith from nearby Murfreesboro. Thomas had come seeking honest work, a steady wage to support a family broken by war and requisitions. On paper, his employment was flawless. Contracts signed, promises made, and wages guaranteed. Yet within weeks he had vanished. His sister Martha arrived at the courthouse, trembling, clutching a worn daguerreotype of her brother. She swore he was a man of integrity, a man who had never touched a drop of alcohol in 7 years. And yet, the Chamberlain's meticulously crafted records claimed otherwise. Thomas had violated his contract, they said, drinking and stealing, and was lawfully dismissed. Sheriff Coleman Briggs, a man seasoned by years of human deceit, found Ezekiel waiting for him on the front steps of Rosewood Manor, ledger in hand, eyes cold and calculating. "Your arrival, Sheriff," Ezekiel said, his voice smooth, aristocratic, controlled. The ledger contained witness statements, dates, and signed confessions, all aligning perfectly to absolve the Chamberlains of responsibility. But the sheriff sensed the lie in the air, the rehearsed cadence, the too perfect documentation, the subtle chemical tang lingering behind the plantation buildings. Something in the smell triggered unease, sharp, metallic, unnatural. Briggs had smelled it before, in the town tannery, but this was more concentrated, more sinister. Martha's faith in justice was shattered when, 3 days later, her body was found floating in the Stones River. The coroner ruled it an accident. The horse she had ridden was grazing nearby, unharmed. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Yet her reticule, along with Thomas' daguerreotype, were missing. The river had claimed her, or so the official story insisted, but the intuition of a man like Sheriff Briggs, the kind of instinct honed over decades, screamed otherwise. Rosewood Manor was no ordinary estate. The Chamberlains were not ordinary people. Soon the pattern repeated itself. Families, laborers, seamstresses, carpenters, all drawn by promises of fair pay, safe work, and stability in a nation unraveling, began to vanish. One letter, then silence. One wagon left behind, then gone. Each disappearance meticulously explained by fabricated infractions, perfectly documented, leaving neighbors and authorities bewildered and helpless. No body, no evidence, no trace of wrongdoing. Only the faint, persistent odor of chemicals and fear that seemed to cling to the very air around the plantation. And through it all, Rosewood Manor thrived. Cotton production surged. Wages were withheld until contracts expired. Workers who asked too many questions were quietly removed. Discipline was law, and the law was what the Chamberlains dictated. This was no chaos, it was control perfect. And in the shadows, Josiah Creek, the overseer, watched, his stomach roiling as he realized he was not merely counting cotton and laborers. He was witnessing the construction of a machine designed to erase human existence while securing wealth, power, and untouchable influence. By the spring of 1862, the Chamberlain twins had fully inherited their father's cold genius, though each expressed it differently. Daniel, the elder by 17 minutes, was thin, nervous. his grey eyes always calculating, spectacles constantly adjusted as if to focus not on reality, but on possibilities. He had studied bookkeeping and chemistry, knowledge that made him invaluable to the family's clandestine operations. Samuel, broader and physically imposing, moved with a predator's ease, enjoyed the physical aspects of enforcement, the hands-on work that his father preferred to delegate. Together, they were the perfect combination of intellect and intimidation, an execution squad for a dynasty built on blood and secrecy. Nightfall brought the true function of Rosewood Manor to life. Lanterns pierced the darkness, casting long shadows across wooden walkways and workers' cabins. Daniel and Samuel moved silently, flanked by two pale strangers whose faces betrayed an education and refinement that seemed almost out of place on a rural Tennessee plantation. They carried leather satchels filled with instruments designed not for medicine, but for erasure, tools for dissolving life into nothingness, chemical agents that would leave no trace for grieving families to find. The twins, confident and practiced, knew every step, every ritual, every shadow where a body could be removed and erased without detection. Josiah Creek, the overseer, began noticing the discrepancies in the workforce. Numbers didn't add up. Food stores lasted longer than they should have. Workers appeared and disappeared with alarming frequency. And then, one humid April night, his suspicions drew him to follow the twins. Hidden in the shadows, heart-pounding, he saw them enter the cabin of Benjamin Carver, a free black man from Memphis who had dared to ask questions about the missing workers. Carver, only 3 weeks into employment, had already noticed the same pattern of absences, the same cold, calculated replacements. 20 minutes later, Daniel and Samuel emerged, carrying a heavy canvas sack. Even in the dim light, Creek could see it bulge and shift unnaturally. The two men moved with purpose, their steps deliberate, unhurried. They were in complete command of the night, the land and the lives within it. As they crossed the plantation grounds toward the old family cemetery, Creek's stomach twisted. This was no ordinary burial, no ordinary punishment. The brothers were part of a system designed to obliterate any trace of the inconvenient, the curious, the disobedient. And then, beyond the manicured gravestones of 3 generations of Chamberlains, the grave itself waited, pre-dug, hidden by undergrowth and shadow. Creek's worst fears were confirmed as he watched the sack lowered into the earth. A glass bottle appeared, a clear liquid poured over the contents, the chemical scent of dissolution cutting through the night air. Ezekiel stood at the edge, speaking in a low voice, words meant for none but those who would understand the gravity of what they were building. 73 souls to build an empire, each life a brick in a dynasty, destined to endure far beyond memory. The barn at Rosewood Manor was no longer a place for tools or storage. Creek's eyes widened as he peered through a gap in the wooden siding, the dim moonlight illuminating a space transformed into a chamber of calculated horror. Large wooden vats lined one wall, filled with liquids that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. The air was thick with the acrid scent of chemicals, the same sharp, metallic odor that had first alerted Sheriff Briggs months before. Creek realized with a chilling clarity that this was the final stage of the Chamberlain process, a place where human existence was dissolved, erased, reduced to nothing. Daniel and Samuel, methodical and unflinching, moved from vat to vat, lowering what remained of the disappeared workers into the caustic liquids. The pale men assisted, precise and almost clinical, ensuring that no fragment, no evidence, no trace of identity survived. Creek's mind reeled as he understood the scale of the operation. 73 souls had passed through this barn, each one meticulously recorded, each one transformed into dust and memory. And with each disappearance, the Chamberlain's empire grew, cemented not just by cotton or contracts, but by fear, secrecy, and the literal obliteration of human life. Outside, Ezekiel monitored the operation with a calculated calm. His family's fortune, built over decades, was no longer threatened by external forces like war, blockades, or political upheaval. The only threats were the living who dared to notice, to question, to resist, and those threats were systematically removed. Margaret's role was equally insidious. Her meticulous record-keeping created a paper trail that legitimized every disappearance. On the surface, Rosewood Manor appeared flawless. Beneath, it was a machine designed for control, power, and impunity, a factory where morality had been stripped away in favor of efficiency. Creek's horror deepened as he recognized the psychological architecture underpinning the Chamberlain empire. Workers who remained were kept compliant through a combination of fear, manipulation, and subtle indoctrination. The promise of wages, room, and board created dependence. False accusations of theft or misconduct provided justification for removal. The very land seemed to enforce obedience. The surrounding forests and river became silent witnesses to unspeakable acts, the perfect camouflage for crimes that would never be admitted publicly. And yet, as grotesque as this system was, it was also brilliant. No army, no law, no moral outrage could dismantle it. The Chamberlains had discovered the ultimate formula. Combine wealth, secrecy, psychological manipulation, and chemical finality, and you become untouchable. Creek felt a transformation within himself, a dread understanding that he was no longer merely an observer, but complicit in a system so vast, so precise, and so merciless that one wrong move could erase him as easily as the others. The communities surrounding Rosewood Manor remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully blind, to the sinister workings inside the plantation's walls. Neighbors whispered of missing families, unexplained absences, and sudden disappearances, yet no one dared speak too loudly. Rumors were dangerous in Rutherford County, and the Chamberlain's reputation as a powerful, untouchable dynasty cast a long shadow. Men like Sheriff Briggs, though uneasy, had only scraps of evidence, and those scraps were expertly neutralized by the Chamberlain's meticulous paperwork. Each disappearance came with a convincing story: contract violations, theft, drunkenness, desertion. The illusion of legality was so perfect that even the most skeptical minds hesitated to challenge it. By the end of 1862, the pattern had become undeniable to those who dared to observe closely. Families arrived seeking employment, often fleeing economic hardship, only to vanish within weeks. James Patterson, a carpenter, sent a single reassuring letter before silence swallowed him entirely. Eleanor Walsh, a young Irish seamstress, arrived with hope in her eyes and a carpet bag of belongings, eager for a fresh start. Weeks later, she was gone. The Freeman family, Isaac, his wife Ruth, and their 2 teenage sons, trusted the Chamberlains with their livelihood, their possessions, their very lives, and were never seen again. Each case was accompanied by meticulously crafted evidence claiming misconduct or abandonment, leaving families frustrated, powerless, and broken. The psychological mechanism was ingenious. Those who remained witnessed disappearances, learned their place, and quickly understood the unspoken rules. Questions were dangerous, observation was perilous, and survival required compliance. Fear was compounded by curiosity. Seeing one neighbor vanish created unease, seeing 2 confirmed danger, seeing dozens established an unshakable dread. And yet, the rewards of obedience, shelter, wages, food, were enough to keep many enslaved by the illusion of security. Workers became both prisoners and enforcers, silent witnesses in a system designed to strip them of autonomy while maximizing the Chamberlain empire. Creek, the overseer, began noticing additional details that no outsider could observe. The flow of supplies never matched the recorded workforce. Tools disappeared and reappeared in unusual patterns. Lights burned late into the night, and shadowy figures moved in the woods beyond the formal cemetery. Every anomaly suggested a precision beyond human reckoning, a combination of wealth, intellect, and cruelty designed to maintain dominance. Ezekiel had created not just a plantation, but a self-contained society operating under his control, where power was absolute and morality subordinate. The Chamberlain's influence extended beyond the physical estate. Federal troops, local officials, and even clergy were kept at a distance by social standing, strategic generosity, and subtle intimidation. The world outside remained largely unaware, while inside Rosewood Manor, life and death were dictated by ledger, lantern, and chemical formula. It was a system that seemed invincible, perfected, and chillingly efficient. And Creek, now fully awake to the horror, realized he was trapped within a mechanism he could not dismantle, a witness to an empire built on 73 unmarked graves and the silent compliance of the living. As the weeks bled into months, the psychological grip the Chamberlain twins exerted over the remaining workers became increasingly apparent. Daniel, with his quiet, calculating presence, manipulated the mind as effectively as his father manipulated contracts. He would watch a man in the fields, note the slightest hesitation or flicker of doubt, and in the dead of night, ensure that those thoughts never developed into resistance. Samuel, on the other hand, thrived on intimidation and fear. A glance, a whispered warning, or the sudden disappearance of a neighbor was enough to silence murmurs of dissent. Together, they had perfected a system where fear and obedience were inseparable, and any attempt at rebellion was smothered before it could take root. The workers, even those who had initially believed in the Chamberlain's promises, were slowly transformed. Hope was replaced by caution, curiosity by calculation. Every step, every word, every glance was weighed. Those who had survived the first wave of disappearances understood instinctively that questions were dangerous and knowledge could be fatal. Conversations became coded, eyes averted, thoughts hidden. Creek observed this subtle transformation with increasing horror. These weren't just laborers, they were prisoners molded into compliance, their minds reshaped by fear, observation, and the silent terror of the missing. But even in a system so tightly controlled, cracks began to appear. A few bold workers whispered among themselves, daring to piece together the anomalies they had witnessed. The fluctuating numbers, the midnight lanterns, the chemical odor that clung to the air, and the unmistakable fact that those who questioned vanished. A spark of defiance, however small, flickered in secret corners of the plantation. Creek noticed it. The furtive glances, the hushed conversations, the way some workers avoided the twins' gaze for just a fraction longer than expected. It was enough to confirm his fear. Even here, in the heart of calculated terror, the human spirit sought escape. Ezekiel and Margaret, ever observant, noticed these subtle signs as well. Their system relied not only on physical erasure, but on mental domination. By monitoring behavior, by rewarding obedience, and by eliminating disobedience without fail, they maintained control. Yet, the mere existence of these whispers threatened the perfection of their operation. To them, even the smallest rebellion was intolerable. And so measures were intensified, patrols doubled, your schedules altered, and the presence of the pale men, the agents of erasure, became more frequent. Every act of defiance, every misstep was met with swift, unseen retribution, reinforcing the lesson that the system tolerated nothing. The tension in the air became almost tangible. Workers carried a collective anxiety like a weight pressing against their chests. Sleep was fitful, meals were eaten in silence, and every step outside the cabins was measured. Creek realized with a growing sense of dread that this was not merely a plantation. It was a psychological experiment in absolute control, a laboratory where human fear, compliance, and mortality were observed, manipulated, and perfected. And as the shadows lengthened over Rosewood Manor, one undeniable truth settled over him. The Chamberlain's power was absolute, and the consequences of knowing too much were final. The pale men who moved through Rosewood Manor like ghosts were perhaps the most enigmatic and terrifying aspect of the Chamberlain operation. Creek had watched them countless nights, always silent, always efficient, always present where death had been quietly arranged. They bore no name, no personal history known to anyone at the plantation, yet their skills suggested training beyond the ordinary. Education in chemistry, medicine, and surgical precision. Their hands were steady, their eyes calculating, and their presence alone inspired a deep, instinctual dread. They were the instruments of erasure, the embodiment of the Chamberlain's absolute control. Creek pieced together their role through observation. When a worker asked too many questions or displayed the smallest hint of curiosity, the pale men appeared. They carried satchels filled with instruments that transformed bodies into nothingness, chemicals that obliterated evidence and erased identity. Creek's stomach would twist at the sight of them working methodically, a dark choreography rehearsed over countless nights. Nights. One misstep, one hesitation, and a human life, sometimes even his own, could be snuffed out without warning. He understood that these men were more than employees. They were extensions of the Chamberlain will, agents who translated the family's cold logic into permanent, physical outcomes. What unsettled Creek most was their silence. They never spoke, never questioned, never revealed motivation. Their loyalty was absolute, unshakable. Even the Chamberlains, for all their power, deferred to them in matters of execution. They moved with purpose as if guided by a code of efficiency and calculation, their presence enforcing the unspoken hierarchy: obey, comply, survive, or vanish. Creek began to notice subtle patterns. Certain cabins targeted at intervals, specific chemicals used depending on the perceived fault of the worker. and always the meticulous cleansing of evidence. The system was not chaotic. It was a machine perfected through experience, one that left no trace for the living to hold on to. Even the Chamberlain twins treated the Pale Men with a mix of awe and respect. And meticulous planning depended on their precision. Samuel's enforcement relied on their ruthless efficiency. Ezekiel himself often watched from the shadows, nodding in approval at their silent work, a quiet acknowledgement that power, when paired with the right instruments, could erase opposition without public scrutiny. These men were the hidden foundation upon which the dynasty's empire rested. Without them, the unbroken chain of disappearances, the perfect maintenance of fear, would falter. They were bound only by contract, loyalty, and possibly ideology, and their presence meant that the Chamberlain's power extended far beyond the plantation. It was a power that could, with subtle precision, reach anyone who threatened to uncover the truth. The lives of 73 victims, and perhaps countless more, were the proof that the system worked, and that resistance was a luxury no one at Rosewood Manor could afford. The influence of the Chamberlain dynasty extended far beyond the gates of Rosewood Manor, seeping like a shadow into the surrounding communities. Federal records were carefully sanitized. Local authorities were intimidated or co-opted. Merchants, clergy, and even neighboring plantation owners learned subtly that challenging the Chamberlains was perilous. Contracts were forged with precision, alliances maintained through strategic generosity, and debts leveraged to ensure silence. By 1863, the family had built not just an empire of cotton, but an empire of obedience, an invisible network of fear that made intervention all but impossible. Creek began to notice the mechanisms at work. Families who arrived seeking employment were never entirely strangers. They were screened, often through local contacts, by intermediaries who ensured that only those willing or desperate enough to comply would approach Rosewood Manor. Payment systems, wages, and ledger entries were designed to create psychological dependence. A worker's desire for sustenance and security made them compliant, while threats of disappearance, subtle or direct, ensured continued obedience. Even letters sent home were controlled, designed to reassure families while masking the grim reality of what occurred inside the plantation walls. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of men vanishing, of families who left for Rosewood and never returned, but those who spread them faced consequences. Gossip could be lethal. Creek realized that the Chamberlain's control was multi-layered, financial, psychological, and social. They had learned to weaponize human nature itself, using fear, ambition, and trust to reinforce their dominion. The wider community, hungry for stability during wartime, accepted the Chamberlain's narrative of order and propriety, never suspecting the machinery of death that operated just out of sight. Even the Civil War, raging across the state, could not disrupt their system. While Union and Confederate forces clashed hundreds of miles away, Rosewood Manor continued its operations unhindered. Ezekiel's double dealings with both sides ensured profit, and his family's internal mechanisms protected the workforce, though not in life, only in function. To outsiders, Rosewood appeared as a model plantation, productive and prosperous, a testament to clever management. Inside, it was a laboratory of control, a place where human lives were meticulously accounted for and removed when inconvenient. Creek understood that this reach was deliberate. The Chamberlains did not merely wish to survive the war. They intended to dominate every social, economic, and psychological sphere available to them. Their wealth was a shield, their reputation a weapon, and their willingness to remove obstacles, any obstacle, cemented their power. And as Creek observed from the shadows, he felt the growing realization that defiance was not just risky, it was suicidal. The dynasty's reach had no boundaries, and its enforcement was absolute. Every missing person was a testament to the system's perfection, a grim warning to anyone who thought themselves free.